Hi, so I'm Greg. I'm going to be talking about the climate change ecology of the South Australian flora. As you can guess, it's quite a broad field covering everything from ecophysiology all the way through to macroecology and broad-scale patterns. So today I'm going to focus on a small number of empirical examples that came out of projects that were done at the University of Adelaide here. There's a lot of different stuff in this area, so I'll just give a few examples and a bit of an overview. So quickly, just to give a bit of an idea of climate change to date in recent years in South Australia, some BOM data. So you can see land temperatures for South Australia have been steadily increasing since around 1950. So before that, not much happened, but since then, quite a strong warming trend, which has shown no sign of letting up. So we've already had around about a degree of warming for South Australia. If you look at the sea surface temperatures, it's been more of a steady trend over the last 100 years or so, again, steadily heading up as we speak. In terms of rainfall for the whole of South Australia, we've had some major droughts, of course, but overall, because of the high variability, there's no overall trend at the moment, although this is including the northern and the southern areas, so probably some trends aren't necessarily going to show up that much. Looking at the latest projections for South Australia, where we're heading with climate change, so here we've got temperature, an example, downscaled projections for Adelaide Mountain Lofty region. Basically, depending on if or when emissions peak, we've got a couple of different models there. So these are 2080 and by 2100. And basically, looking at over here, spring temperatures particularly, looking by the end of the century, rising 2 to 4 degrees is the current projection. So that's going to be quite significant for plant physiology and ecology, as I'll show you with some examples. If we get those kind of changes, that's going to really drive some changes. So looking at rainfall projections, projections currently basically north of the state, there's going to be more warming compared to the south of the state, but about the same rainfall or maybe some more summer rainfall, whereas in the south of the state we're looking at a drying trend as expected. So this is an example for Eyre Peninsula, and again we're seeing in decades to come some pretty serious predicted deficits, especially for spring, so up to as much as sort of 30% declines, which sound pretty extreme, but I think if we take the Western Australian example, we can see that these things can actually happen, so pretty strong deficits. So in terms of climate change ecology, there's a whole lot of stuff in it, as I said, but this is one of the main ways we look at it as an overview. So if we start with, in a region, a pool of species that occur across a particular region, so that pool of species has arisen due to all the history that we've heard about, a lot of things involved in why that particular pool of species is there in the first place. But basically, in landscape ecology, we talk about these species being filtered and sorted across a landscape. Some of that has to do with sort of random processes, like are they able to get there and disperse there, chance events, historical events, a whole lot of other stuff. But there's also a sort of deterministic component here where species are filtered out according to a range of environmental variables. And obviously, the most important of those is generally climate. So basically, within a region, you see a pattern along a climate gradient. You see certain patterns of species composition that change predictably along that gradient. There's also feedbacks with what the individual plants do. They interact with each other. They can have adaptive responses, etc. So going into a bit of more empirical example of what that filtering process looks like. So this is some data from the Adelaide, Mount Lofty and Flinders Ranges regions from the Biological Survey of South Australia. These scenarios are getting a bit outdated, but this is based on some sort of 2030 scenarios for climate change, 2070 scenarios for climate change, and we look at how that maps out spatially. So if we look at those equivalent amount of climatic differences spatially as we head north, we can look at what that does to the species composition of the vegetation. So over here we show that if we compare sites with different climate controlling for the spatial component of that, as we go up towards one, we're getting more turnover in species. So when you get up here, we're talking about pretty much no species shared, so completely different systems, whereas down here is when you share the same set of species. So what you can see from this is with a more extreme scenario of nearly 4 degrees temperature rise by 2070 and 30% drop in rainfall, looking at the spatial pattern of that same climate difference today, we'd expect eventually that would actually completely turn over the plant community. So in time you would see absolutely no species of a particular site with that much change would be able to persist there. But even at the lowest end here, where you've only got, in this scenario here, no rainfall change and only a 0.4 degrees temperature increase, which is we've already exceeded, straight away you get this very steep curve happening, and pretty quickly you get strong species turnover and differences between communities. This isn't just kind of incidental species turnover, it's involved in a major shift in the composition of the families that are there. So there are families characteristic of more mesic climates as opposed to more arid. So down here you've got things like lilies and heaths and that kind of thing. And up here you've got more malvaceae and those kind of things. So we're talking about very different characterisation of those communities. So this came out of a recent biodiversity mapping project. That nice map of South Australia there is a climate sensitivity map. So what we did was look at the species composition in map grid cells across the whole state based on many, many records that we were able to put together. And then we extract how the variation in how the composition in those cells occurs in terms of temperature changes. So we're particularly looking at how different are those cells based on how different are they in temperature spatially. And that hot yellow colour zone there is basically much higher sensitivity to climate spatially. So what we get is much higher turnover with temperature through those regions. And basically we've interpreted that as being a transition or an ecotone between the mesic south and the outback areas. The red areas on that map, there's still turnover with climate changes, but it's much slower, whereas in that yellow zone there, it's very rapid. So there's doesn't take a lot of temperature change there to get completely different communities. So projecting forward, that's potentially an area of the state where communities will be highly sensitive to climate change, and we would expect to see the fastest rate of turnover. But there's also the ability for many species to tolerate changes up to a certain point. So it's not always just going to resort the species across the landscape. Some species have wider capacity in what they can tolerate, but also we know that species have some capacity to adapt and change to conditions. So this is an example, again, good old Dodona viscosa, which is getting a bit of a workout around here with a whole lot of projects going on. This stuff's a little bit older, so these charts here are showing some work based on herbarium records, showing that leaf width throughout the Flinders Ranges area in this species becomes much smaller as we head north, which is most strongly correlated with maximum temperatures. So we've got this strong trend. Leaves are narrow as you get north. Also, if you look at the stomata of the same species in the same sort of areas, the stomatal density is going up at the same time. And so what that looks like is a pretty good adaptation for increasing aridity. So if you've got narrow leaves and more stomata, that's good for convective heat loss. It's also good for evaporative cooling. This chart here shows also through herbarium analysis looking at that leaf width trait in the same set of specimens. Basically in this chart, time is going through here, and this is latitude, and the dots represent samples broken up into areas with the mean leaf width. So basically what we've seen is that not only with latitude, but over time there's a trend in that character. So over time, over here, all these collections here, have much narrower leaves than the earlier collections. So it suggests that over this period here, there's been actually quite a strong shift in that leaf trait towards a narrower, more arid adapted morphology. So this is some work from Matt Christmas that was completed recently on the same species, looking at genomic traits. And this chart shows a set of genes that Matt investigated. And these were genes that had polymorphisms that were strongly correlated with environmental stress. So, for example, there are around 30 genes that had polymorphisms that were related to response to water deprivation. There are also genes that correlated with environment that were possibly related to leaf shape and stomatal development. Here's an example of just one of those genes changing in frequency along a latitudinal gradient through that area. So you can see it's quite clear that there's something going on with climate there. I don't need to explain this slide as much because Cheska has already talked quite a lot about carbon isotopes, but basically applying that similar approach of the ratio, the carbon isotope ratio, from some work Stefan Kadiratelik has been doing. But this is pooling over 100 species of different groups across that same region. You can see there's a very strong trend across all those groups of increasing water stress. So we can see that there's a lot of pretty obvious physiological responses going across the whole flora in response to climate. So in summary, we're looking at a much warmer and drier climate in South Australia. And that's going to have an immediate response in terms of water stress. We're going to see a physiological response to that we've seen in terms of isotopes. And that will play out over time. So initially you get those physiological responses that will lead to different rates of reproduction, different rates of mortality. Some species may be able to adapt to that by changing their physiology, changing their morphology. But eventually, with a strong enough change in climate or beyond the capacity of the species to adapt, we expect to see distribution changes, and that's going to lead to strong turnover in communities. One thing we don't know about that, though, because a lot of our work is based on spatial analysis of climatic differences. So one thing we don't really know is how long does it take if you increase the temperature by 3 degrees? How long does it take for that to play out and actually turn over the species into a different composition? So as part of that, we've got a set of monitoring plots through the Mount Lofty and Flinders ranges here. And we're using that to sample along that climatic gradient. And we're hoping that over time we'll be able to detect that climatic signal and change. There's also a lot of other changes, time since fire. There's differences between sites. There's history and chance. But in the long term, we hope to be able to detect how fast it's actually turning over due to climate. But we also need to look a bit more in more sophisticated ways at how climate change is actually going to work over time. So we tend to look at it in isolation. What does it do to physiology? What does it do to species turnover spatially? But there's a whole lot of factors that are going to play into it. What happens to ecosystems over time? So at the moment, we're developing more complex models of looking at this, where we include stuff on fire regimes, but also the degree of habitat fragmentation across the landscape and how that influences the resilience. And then we'll be able to play with that with a range of climate and management scenarios to get a more realistic projection of where the flora will head. Thank you.
Probably got time for one question. No? Thanks. Okay, next speaker is Casey Hall, who's talking about ecologically guided discovery of